Hey, here we go. This is a not so cheery topic. I recognize that, and don't let the cartoon fool you. This is a pretty serious topic when we discuss brain injuries and disorders. So what I want to do is highlight some of the major lines of discussion that are going on today about brain research, in particular as it relates to some trauma and a few diseases. So I give you this list. Let me go away for a second. Not for you, obviously, to memorize these, but when you look at this list and we're trying to figure out if someone actually experienced a brain injury, you can see here the list is pretty extensive when we're looking at physical symptoms, sensory symptoms, cognitive or mental symptoms. Do they show issues with concentration, memory, mood? And then they're looking at whether or not we classify this as a mild traumatic brain injury, an MTBI, or maybe a TBI, a more serious one. The rule of thumb is if you ever suspect that somebody has a brain injury, you treat them as if they do. But this just gives you a list, and you'll even see some things that seem a little contradictory. I encourage you to take a second and just look at the slide. Let me make sure you can see all of it here. Just take a minute and look at the slide and just kind of get a sense of the kinds of symptoms that we associate with potential kinds of injuries, whether it's mild or whether it's severe. Okay, so let's start looking at, there's really not room for me, I'll try to come over here in the corner. When we start considering the kinds of brain injuries that we discuss, usually we start with concussion as an MBTI, a mild, MTBI, mild traumatic brain injury, not MBTI. So a concussion, and it's sort of misnamed to say a concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury, because mild and traumatic don't seem to go together. But a concussion is, what you see here, a violent jarring or shaking that results in disturbance of brain function. And disturbance of brain function is sort of a key term. We really can't diagnose a concussion by doing an x-ray or doing a blood test or some kind of scan, because it appears the damage is going to be almost microscopic, that we have a disruption in the signaling of the brain because of this mild traumatic brain injury, but it's not something we can visibly see. We don't see evidence of it in any kind of diagnostic test. What appears to happen, of course, is that, here he goes, we have some kind of injury, and the concussion where you see the brain collides with the skull. So the head stops moving very quickly, the brain continues to shift inside of the skull and causes some trauma to the brain. Now again, if we're talking about a concussion, we're talking about a disruption of normal brain functioning. It doesn't necessarily result in bleeding, doesn't necessarily result in issues related that we would associate with more traumatic brain injuries, and we'll get to those in a second. Here is one of the concerns, though. Oops, let me go back. Here's one of the concerns, is that it's the second or the third or the fourth concussion that really causes us concern. If a person has not fully recovered from a concussion and experiences a second one, and some of the brain trauma has not been fully recovered, then the next concussion can cause more damage, and as you see here, that can cause, for example, brain swelling, which can cut off the blood supply and even result in death. Or at the very least, some severe ongoing cognitive and motor function disruption. So that's why you see all the concern now about concussions, and we'll talk about sports more in a second. A key factor then is being able to diagnose the severity of a concussion, and again, you can't do a scan and see this. So you see up here in this chart how some people have chosen to try to classify concussions as grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, mild, moderate to severe. And again, I'm not going to ask you to look at these in any great detail and memorize all the classifications here, but just look at kind of what they're looking at. If there is no loss of consciousness, there's some confusion, and that's pretty much it. It could be, quote unquote, you got your bell rung, and that could be considered a mild grade 1 concussion. Therefore, your time back on the field or back on the court or back in whatever you're doing will be shorter. If you experience a grade 3, a more severe concussion, then that means that you probably need to be out longer because there was more likely more brain trauma, and therefore you need more time to recover before you can get back in and risk another concussion. one issue you have with brain injuries also, and this is actually going to kind of lead into the next one, is you have what's called a coup contra coup injury. You have the initial site of the injury over here where, oops, keep losing my place here. You see the initial site, the brain hits this thing, this fixed object, and of course the brain is going to hit inside the skull on that side, and there you're going to have some upsetting of the brain chemistry, of the brain electrical signals, but you also have the rebound effect. As the brain bounces from the initial site of injury, it will bounce back. So on the opposite side of the injury, what's called the contra coup, you're going to have injury as well. So sometimes the concussion is not just localized to the site of the where the brain, where the skull hits something. It also could be on the opposite side as well. Remember, the brain is moving around, it's kind of floating inside of the cranium, so the brain is not going to be able to stop as quickly as the skull. When it pushes in and pushes back out, or pushes forward and pushes back, you're going to have the risk of an injury called a contra coup injury, also associated with potential either a mild or even more severe brain injury. We'll talk about those in a second. So we get to this issue of whether or not sports are safe, and clearly we run the risk whenever we play a collision sport of potential head injuries. As you all know, as you know, I do referee soccer. They have changed the guidelines on youth heading the ball, and now kids 10 and under in most leagues do not head the ball. Why? Well, they are concerned for a couple of reasons. One, there's a big lawsuit going on, but two, does a kid need to be learning to head the ball to hit even a soft inflated object with their head to play soccer? The answer is no. So if kids are not doing that, they're not incurring any repeated head banging of the ball, then maybe they will not experience any even mild symptoms from concussions. But the issue, I can tell you as a referee, is not the ball. It's hitting somebody else's head. And this is often what you will see. You'll see players on the ground, they both go up and challenge for the ball. And so the issue isn't the soft round ball, it's someone else's hard head. So there are some concerns about sports. You've heard all about football, of course, but also in some other sports, whether or not it is safe to play the way we're using the rules now to play those games. Let's look at some more serious kinds of brain trauma. Let's look at some TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, and look at some of the differences between these and concussions. And let's start with cerebral contusions and cerebral lacerations. A brain contusion or a cerebral contusion is a TBI where it's essentially a bruise of the brain tissue. Think of it as like a bruise on your arm. You have some swelling, you have some blood accumulation. So perhaps because of a coup contra coup injury, you had some areas of the brain where you had some microhemorrhages and you had some bleeding. That's a brain bruise. That's a cerebral contusion. A cerebral laceration is sort of the same thing, but here's where scientists and doctors kind of make a distinction. If there is a tearing of the pia or the arachnoid membranes, that's considered a cerebral laceration. If there's not a tearing and there's bruising, that's a cerebral contusion. Please don't think that contusions then are really okay and lacerations are a lot more serious. In both cases, we're worried about brain herniation. The blood accumulating even from a cerebral contusion can be serious and can begin to put pressure on parts of the brain. And whenever, again, the brain is increasing in size, or the cranial cavity rather is limited in size, if we increase the volume because of blood as pooling in the brain, like you see here in this hematoma, hematomas over here, then that's a big concern. What about when you've heard about epidural and subdural hemorrhages or hematomas? What are these? An epidermal hemorrhage is when blood is forced between the dura mater and the cranium. Between the dura mater and the cranium. And obviously the issue is that is a very tight space as it is, and if you start forcing blood in there, it can result in some distortion of the brain. The most serious kind of an epidural hemorrhage is when you have an arterial bleed. If you bust an artery and you start to accumulate the blood between the dura and the cranium, because of the arterial pressure, you get a lot of blood out pretty quickly. People with an epidural hemorrhage almost always lose consciousness from minutes to hours after the injury, and if they do not get this treated, it's 100% fatal. Even if they do get it treated, it's about 50% fatal, because the symptoms come on really quickly and they can lose a lot of blood, and that's not the biggest issue. The brain tissue gets damaged as a result. If it happens to be an epidural hemorrhage that's related to veins, that's not quite so serious and not quite so urgent to treat, because veins are under lower pressure. So if you get some bleeding from a vein, the symptoms don't come on as quickly. They may not have issues for hours or days or even weeks after the initial injury. So that is not as serious a concern. It still must be treated though. Epidural hemorrhages, though, are relatively rare. Less than 1% of head injuries involve epidural hemorrhages, but as you can tell, they're quite serious when they do happen. A subdural hemorrhage are twice as likely to happen, and this results when you tear veins, typically in the subdural space. It's a little misleading to say subdural hemorrhage, because sometimes the blood will seep its way in between the periosteal and the meningeal dura mater. But typically we're talking about veins being torn, and this forms the pools that form a subdural hematoma. Again, blood is accumulating in that subdural space. So once again, mortality is going to be high, because even a slow bleed can cause pressure on the brain, and by the time someone is treated, they may have suffered some irreversible brain damage. You might recognize then this kind of mode of death that we see in shaken baby syndrome. There is what doctors and police call the triad. If they see a baby that has subdural hematomas, they have evidence of retinal issues like retinal bleeding, brain swelling, those are the big three, but also if they have evidence of bone fractures or abuse, then this indicates most likely shaken baby syndrome. Somebody got upset, shook a baby, and the brain bounced around, and it's going to result in usually a slow bleed. What tends to happen in shaken baby syndromes, what we hear from people, is somebody who shakes a baby because it's crying. They shake it a few times, and then the baby stops crying. They think, woo, they put the baby down, and the baby doesn't wake up. The subdural hemorrhage occurs, the baby suffers brain damage, and even those babies that don't die from shaken baby syndrome often have non-fatal blindness. They may have issues with motor impairment or cognitive impairment, so it's a pretty serious issue. Finally, let me end. I can't come back. I can't find my camera. Let me end with some brain disorders. We'll do these pretty quickly. You've heard of most of these. A cerebrovascular accident, a CVA, is another term for a stroke, and the causes of this are intracerebral hemorrhage, blood clots, or atherosclerosis. Somebody who has a clot or blockage in an artery of their brain can have a CVA. Risk factors: if somebody has high blood pressure, high cholesterol, if they've had TIAs, which we'll get to in a second, or smoking, these are all risks for strokes, and stroke is one of the leading causes of death in the United States. A TIA is a transient ischemic attack. Think of this like a warning sign for a CVA. The people who have TIAs have impaired blood flow to their brain because maybe they have a partial clot, and so they have symptoms that would mirror in many ways a CVA. They may have dizziness, weakness, paralysis, slurred speech, but it goes away. And sometimes you've heard the term mini stroke. These are not strokes. These are not technically strokes, but they are kind of the warning sign that there's impaired circulation, which could lead to a CVA. And in fact, as you see here, about 1/3 of the patients with a TIA will have a CVA within 5 years. So for people who have a TIA and they go, "Whoa, I don't know what that was. I'm glad I don't have it anymore." Okay, well, that's a sign that they should be treated. Alzheimer's. When we talk about Alzheimer's, we really get into a very difficult area because we don't understand Alzheimer's very well. We do know it deals largely with the hippocampus, which is a region of the brain that helps us make new memories. So people with Alzheimer's can't develop new memories. They may recall things from a long time ago, but they can't recall something that happened yesterday. There's an increased risk associated with previous head injuries, even going back many, many years. It's not to suggest if you had a concussion when you were 17 or you fell off a ladder when you were 10 and you suffered, you blacked out. That's not saying that you're necessarily going to have Alzheimer's. But we have found there's a slight increase in Alzheimer's risk for people who have had a previous head injury, so that's something that scientists are still exploring. And finally, when we consider Parkinson's, I just wanted to mention Parkinson's because it is a neurotransmitter issue. The most obvious symptom, of course, are people with shakes. They have uncontrolled shaking. They have motor control disruption. Michael J. Fox is one of the more recent examples of people who have come forward with Parkinson's, and it's linked to the loss of dopamine. People who have Parkinson's have very low levels of dopamine. Dopamine apparently is going to be extremely important for the regulation of this motor control. People who don't have enough dopamine are going to have, again, impaired control, shaking, but eventually it leads to far worse things. They will eventually be in wheelchairs. They will often experience dementia. They often become suicidal because of this issue related to their brain is still sort of functioning, but they lose a lot of their feelings of self-worth because they have gone this steadily decline in Parkinson's. Causes, we don't really know. There are people who've tried to suggest that certain things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are related to environmental toxins and things of that nature, but we really have not a lot of evidence to suggest for sure specific causes to these. That wraps up this video. Thank you very much.